10 ideas are about to unfold here, and every single one of them will sound deceptively simple the moment it's said out loud. That's exactly the problem. A person can hear the sky isn't the weather and nod along, already moving to the next thought, without ever noticing that this one distinction, barely 8 words, quietly explains why the same emotional storm keeps returning year after year, no matter how many times it's supposedly been dealt with. The mind is remarkably good at understanding an idea and remarkably bad at actually living inside it. Notice this while watching. Some of these shifts will feel obvious, almost too small to matter. Closing a door with an exhale, standing barefoot on grass for 5 minutes, naming a thought instead of arguing with it. And yet, somewhere in the middle of hearing them, a specific memory or moment from someone's actual life will surface uninvited. An argument that was never finished. A version of themselves they stopped defending years ago. A room in their own mind they've been avoiding walking into. That reaction isn't a coincidence. It's usually the clearest sign of exactly where the real work is waiting. What makes this particular way of looking at healing different isn't the techniques themselves, breathing, grounding, movement, none of that is new. It's the order these ideas were placed in, and the way each one quietly depends on the one before it. Loving what can't be fixed, yet only becomes possible once someone stops mistaking their thoughts for their identity. Letting an emotion finish only becomes possible once the ground beneath the body has been remembered. Nothing here works in isolation, which is precisely why skipping to the useful part rarely produces the shift people are hoping for. So this isn't really a video to watch passively in the background. It's closer to a mirror, one that reflects back exactly which parts of a person's healing have been rushed, avoided, or half-finished for years. Pay attention to which idea creates the most resistance. That reaction, more than anything else being said, is the most honest starting point available. Most people spend their whole lives searching for a cure to something they were never taught how to name. They read the books, they try the routines, they collect the advice, and still, underneath all of it, something keeps whispering that the real thing hasn't been touched yet. This is because the deepest wound rarely shows up as a diagnosis. It doesn't have a clean label, a category, a box to check on a form. It shows up as an ache that outlives explanation, a heaviness that follows a person from childhood into boardrooms, into marriages, into quiet Sunday afternoons where nothing is wrong and yet everything feels unfinished. That ache has a strange intelligence to it. It doesn't ask to be diagnosed. It asks to be recognized. Picture a man who spent 15 years building a career that impressed everyone except himself. From the outside, his life read like a success story, promotions, a beautiful home, a family that loved him. But every night, right before sleep, a familiar heaviness would settle into his chest, uninvited, patient and old. He tried therapy, he tried travel, he tried buying his way into peace. None of it worked because he was treating a symptom while ignoring the source. The source wasn't an event. It was an absence, a version of himself that had gone unseen for so long it had stopped expecting to be found. Healing didn't begin the day he fixed something. It began the day he stopped looking outside himself for the fix. This is the paradox almost nobody talks about, the cure people search for in books, in mentors, in far-off retreats, has usually been living inside them the entire time, waiting patiently to be acknowledged rather than achieved. Wholeness was never something to be earned through more effort. It was something buried under years of performing, adapting, and surviving. A useful practice here is simple but rarely done. Sit for 10 minutes in silence and ask, not what's wrong with me, but what part of me has been waiting the longest to be heard. No fixing, no analyzing, just listening, the way a person listens to an old friend who finally decided to speak after years of staying quiet in the corner of the room. What makes this wound so difficult to face isn't its intensity, it's its familiarity. It has been present for so long that it no longer feels like pain, it feels like personality. A person mistakes their armor for their identity, their coping mechanisms for their character, their silence for peace. And yet, underneath every defense mechanism carefully built over decades, there is a self that was never actually damaged, only buried under protective layers designed to keep it safe from a world that once felt too dangerous to be vulnerable in. The real work isn't repairing what's broken. It's remembering what was never broken to begin with, and that remembering starts somewhere most people are taught to avoid entirely. There is a mistake almost everyone makes without realizing it, and it happens dozens of times a day. A wave of anxiety rolls through the chest, and instantly the mind concludes, "I am anxious." A flood of sadness arrives uninvited, and the mind whispers, "I am broken." But here is something worth sitting with slowly. The storm passing through a person is not the same as the person it's passing through. Emotions and sensations behave exactly like weather. They arrive, they intensify, they eventually move on, no matter how permanent they seem in the moment. Underneath all of that motion, something else has been quietly present the entire time, untouched by the turbulence happening on the surface. Think of a woman who used to believe her anxiety defined her. Every racing heartbeat felt like proof that something was fundamentally wrong with who she was. It wasn't until she began separating the sensation from her identity that something shifted. She started using a simple phrase whenever the storm hit. Anxiety is visiting again, instead of "I am anxious." That tiny linguistic shift did something remarkable. It created distance between the experiencer and the experience. A practical exercise worth trying: the next time a heavy emotion shows up, name it out loud as a visitor rather than a verdict. Frustration is here right now carries a completely different weight than "I am frustrated." One is a passing condition. The other is a life sentence. This is the quiet distinction between the one who suffers and the one who watches the suffering happen. Consciousness itself functions like the sky, vast, spacious, and fundamentally undisturbed no matter what clouds move across it. A hurricane can tear through the atmosphere, and still, above the clouds, the sky remains exactly as open as it always was. This isn't a comforting metaphor meant to minimize real pain. It's a description of something structurally true about awareness. A person can feel grief completely, cry until there's nothing left, and still, somewhere beneath the grief, there is a quiet witness that was never actually shattered, only present, watching, holding space for the storm to pass through. Most people never learn to locate that witness because they were taught to identify entirely with the weather. School taught facts. Nobody taught the difference between having a feeling and becoming one. Books like The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer explore this exact terrain, the practice of stepping back from the internal noise long enough to notice who's actually doing the noticing. But knowing about the sky intellectually and actually resting in it are two very different things. The gap between those two gets closed through something almost embarrassingly simple, something most people rush past without ever truly practicing it, and it starts with nothing more than the way a person breathes. Most people breathe thousands of times a day without ever noticing that each exhale is quietly doing something profound. It isn't just air leaving the lungs, it's a release, a small letting go that happens whether a person is paying attention or not. What if every breath out was treated not as a mechanical function, but as the closing of a door behind you? Not slammed shut in anger, not locked in fear, just gently closed the way someone closes a door on a room they no longer need to occupy. And every breath in then becomes something else entirely. A fresh invitation into the only moment that has ever actually existed. This one, right here, happening now. Consider a man who spent years carrying the weight of a conversation that ended badly a decade earlier. He replayed it constantly, in the shower, during meetings, right before falling asleep. One evening, a teacher suggested something unusual. Each time the memory surfaced, exhale slowly and imagine physically closing a door on that scene, not to forget it, but to stop living inside it. Not erasing the room, just no longer sitting in it every single day. Within weeks, the memory still existed, but it no longer had a grip on his nervous system. This is worth trying directly. Next time an old memory or worry loops in the mind, take one slow breath out and mentally picture a door closing softly on that specific thought. Then breathe in and ask, what's actually happening right now, in this room, in this body? This isn't about ignoring the past or pretending pain didn't happen. It's about recognizing that breath is the one biological function acting as a built-in ritual of release, available every single second without asking permission from anyone. Ancient traditions understood this long before modern science gave it vocabulary. Practices like pranayama in yogic tradition or the Buddhist attention to breath in vipassana meditation all point toward the same underlying truth: the breath is not just biology, it's a doorway. Every exhale carries the residue of what no longer serves. Every inhale offers a clean, undamaged moment, completely untouched by whatever came before it. What makes this practice so easy to dismiss is exactly what makes it so powerful. It's free, it's always available, and it requires no equipment, no retreat, no permission slip from anyone. A person doesn't need a mountain in Nepal to access this. They need 3 minutes and a willingness to notice what's already happening inside their own chest. And once someone learns to consciously close doors on what no longer serves them through something as simple as an exhale, a much harder question starts to surface, one that has less to do with letting go and much more to do with what happens next, when a person is finally asked to sit with the parts of themselves still waiting in the room they haven't closed the door on yet. There is a quiet belief hiding underneath most self-improvement efforts, and it rarely gets said out loud: I will love myself once I've fixed this. Once the weight is lost, once the temper is controlled, once the fear is gone, then, finally, self-acceptance is allowed to begin. But this belief has the entire process backwards. Compassion was never meant to be the reward waiting at the finish line. It was meant to be the ground a person stands on while still in the middle of the mess, still unfinished, still carrying wounds that haven't closed yet. Loving a part of yourself that's still hurting isn't weakness or denial. It's the exact condition that actually allows healing to happen in the first place. Picture a woman who battled a short temper for most of her adult life. She'd snap at her children, then spend hours afterward drowning in guilt, promising herself she'd be better, more patient, more in control. The cycle repeated for years because every attempt at change was fueled by shame, and shame, by its nature, tends to recreate the exact behavior it's trying to punish. Everything shifted the day she tried something different. Instead of attacking the anger after it happened, she began placing a hand on her chest in the moment it rose and saying quietly, I see you, and you don't have to prove anything right now. A practical version of this anyone can try the next time a flaw shows up: impatience, insecurity, an old habit resurfacing. Pause and speak to it the way a parent speaks to a frightened child, not the way a drill sergeant speaks to a failure. This distinction matters because there are two entirely different energies behind change. One says, I am unacceptable until I improve. The other says, I am already worthy of care, and from that care, real change becomes possible. The first creates a war against the self that never ends, because a war implies an enemy, and making an enemy out of your own psyche guarantees an eventual defeat. The second approach, the one found in the writings of Tara Brach in her work on radical acceptance, or Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion, treats the wounded part not as an obstacle to defeat, but as a frightened part of the self still waiting to feel safe enough to soften. None of this means excusing harmful behavior or avoiding accountability. It means recognizing that the parts of a person still causing pain are usually the parts that were never given permission to be imperfect in the first place. A child who was punished for crying grows into an adult who punishes themselves for feeling weak. A person taught that anger was shameful grows into someone at war with their own reactions decades later. Healing that childhood wound doesn't happen through more discipline. It happens through the radical, almost rebellious act of sitting beside the wounded part and staying, even when, especially when, that part starts making noise, demanding attention in ways that feel impossible to ignore. Imagine coming home to find someone sitting uninvited in your living room. The natural instinct is to confront them, demand they leave, maybe even raise a voice. Now imagine this happens dozens of times a day, every single day, for an entire lifetime. Except the intruder isn't a person. It's a thought. And most people spend an exhausting amount of energy fighting with guests who were never actually looking for a fight in the first place. They just wanted to be acknowledged. The mind doesn't need to be silenced into submission. It needs to stop being treated like an enemy that has to be defeated before peace can begin. Consider a young entrepreneur who couldn't sleep most nights because his mind kept replaying every possible way his business could fail. He tried forcing the thoughts away, tried arguing back with logic, tried drowning them out with noise and distraction. Nothing worked, because arguing with a thought only proves to the mind that the thought deserves a debate. Everything changed when he tried a different approach. Instead of engaging, he simply acknowledged the thought's presence, there you are again, worried about the numbers, and let it sit there, unchallenged, without feeding it further attention. A useful practice here, the next time a repetitive worry shows up, try silently saying noted instead of building a case against it. No debate, no resistance, just recognition, and then a gentle return to whatever's actually happening in front of you. This shift matters because resistance is what gives a thought its staying power. A guest who gets ignored eventually grows quiet and wanders off on their own. A guest who gets argued with feels important enough to stay for hours, sometimes years. The mind operates on a similar logic. Thoughts that get fought tend to loop, tighten, and multiply, while thoughts that simply get witnessed without engagement tend to lose their grip far faster than anyone expects. This isn't passive avoidance. It's a form of active, disciplined presence that requires far more strength than arguing ever did. What most people never realize is that the goal was never a silent mind. Silence isn't the absence of guests walking through the house. It's a different kind of relationship with the noise itself. One where a person can sit in the middle of a crowded room, guests talking over each other, and still remain completely undisturbed at the center of it all. That kind of stillness doesn't come from control. It comes from something much harder to explain and much easier to feel, something that starts to reveal itself the moment a person stops mistaking the absence of sound for the presence of peace. Most people believe they'll find inner peace once life finally becomes quiet, once the kids are grown, once the job calms down, once the world stops demanding so much. But this belief sets a trap that never actually springs shut, because external circumstances rarely cooperate long enough to deliver that promised silence. Meanwhile, something far more available gets overlooked entirely, a silence that has nothing to do with decibels and everything to do with the quality of presence a person brings into the noise itself. This kind of silence can exist in the middle of a crying baby, a deadline, a crowded subway car, because it was never about the environment to begin with. Think of a nurse working double shifts in a hospital emergency room surrounded by alarms, urgent voices, and constant motion. By every external measure, her environment was the opposite of peaceful, and yet she described moments, brief, powerful moments, where something inside her went completely still even as chaos moved around her at full speed. She wasn't checked out or numb. She was fully present, fully engaged, and somehow untouched at the core, all at the same time. A practical way to access this during a genuinely chaotic moment, instead of waiting for the noise to end, try silently asking, "Can I find one still point inside myself right now?" without needing anything outside to change first. Often, the answer arrives faster than expected. This distinction separates real inner stillness from the popular idea of escaping into calm environments. A quiet room can still contain a mind at war with itself, replaying arguments, rehearsing anxieties, spinning through worst-case scenarios. Meanwhile, a busy kitchen during a family dinner can contain a person who feels entirely at peace, fully rooted in the present moment, unbothered by the surrounding volume. Silence, in its truest form, isn't a location. It's a relationship, the relationship between a person and whatever is happening around them, built not on control of the environment, but on the steadiness of attention brought into it. This kind of presence isn't reserved for monks or people with fewer obligations. It's built the same way any skill gets built, through small, repeated moments of choosing to stay rooted rather than swept away, especially when staying rooted feels the least convenient. And once someone tastes even a few seconds of that particular stillness in the middle of real-world noise, something else begins to stir, a pull toward the earth itself, toward something older than any technique, something the body seems to remember long before the mind catches up to it. There's a particular kind of relief that happens the moment bare feet touch grass, or hands sink into soil, or a body lies flat against the earth after a long day. It isn't relaxation in the ordinary sense. It feels closer to recognition, like something ancient inside the body just exhaled for the first time in weeks. Nature doesn't teach anything new in these moments. It doesn't hand over wisdom the way a book or a mentor might. It simply reminds the body of something it never actually forgot, something that got buried under concrete, deadlines, and fluorescent lighting for far too long. Picture a software engineer who spent 12 years working from a desk, rarely stepping outside except to move between buildings. Anxiety had become such a constant companion, he'd stopped noticing it as unusual. A doctor eventually suggested something that felt almost too simple to work: 20 minutes outside every day, feet on real ground, no phone, no destination. Within a month, something in his baseline nervous system had shifted, measurably, undeniably. This is worth trying directly. Find any patch of grass, dirt or sand, remove the shoes, and stand there for 5 full minutes doing absolutely nothing else. Not meditating, not analyzing, just standing, letting the body remember contact with something it evolved alongside for hundreds of thousands of years. Researchers studying this phenomenon call it grounding or earthing, and while the scientific conversation around it is still developing, something simpler and harder to dispute shows up anecdotally again and again. People report feeling calmer, more regulated, more like themselves after even brief contact with natural ground. This makes sense when considered honestly. Human bodies did not evolve indoors, under artificial light, disconnected from soil and season and weather. A person can spend a lifetime believing they need to travel far to feel whole again, when often what's missing is available in a backyard, a park, a single tree on a city block. This return isn't sentimental nostalgia for a simpler time. It's a recalibration of a nervous system that was never designed to run at the pace modern life demands without regular contact with something slower, older. and steadier than itself. The earth doesn't rush, it doesn't perform. It simply holds, the way it has held every living thing that ever stood on it. And once a person starts listening to what the ground has to offer, a quieter, more uncomfortable question begins to surface about how much the body itself has been trying to say, long before any of this discomfort turned into something loud enough to finally be impossible to ignore. By the time pain becomes impossible to ignore, a frozen shoulder, a chronic headache, a back that won't straighten, it's easy to assume the problem just appeared out of nowhere. But the body rarely works that way long before pain arrives. It tends to whisper first, a subtle tightness ignored during a stressful meeting, a shallow breath held through an uncomfortable conversation, a stomach that clenched during an argument and simply never got the message to unclench. The scream people eventually feel is almost never the beginning of the story. It's the ending of a conversation the body has been trying to start for a very long time. Consider a woman who developed severe migraines every few weeks for years, cycling through medications that only dulled the symptom without touching the source. A somatic therapist finally asked her a question no doctor had asked. What were you doing right before the pain usually starts? Digging into the pattern revealed something unmistakable. The migraines consistently followed moments where she'd suppressed something she desperately wanted to say. Her body had been screaming what her voice refused to speak. A practical exercise worth trying: once a day, pause and do a slow scan from head to feet, noticing where tension is quietly sitting, the jaw, the shoulders, the stomach, and simply ask that area, what are you holding on to right now? Movement, done consciously rather than mechanically, becomes a form of listening rather than just exercise. This doesn't require a gym membership or an hour-long routine. Practices like gentle yoga, walking without headphones, or even simply stretching slowly while paying full attention to sensation all create space for the body to communicate before it has to escalate into something painful enough to demand attention. The goal isn't fitness in the traditional sense, it's fluency. Learning to read a language the body has been speaking fluently the entire time while the mind stayed too busy to translate it. This kind of attentiveness changes the entire relationship a person has with their own physical experience. Instead of treating the body as a machine that occasionally breaks down and needs repair, it becomes something closer to a trusted messenger, one that's been faithfully reporting information all along, waiting patiently for someone to finally take the message seriously. And once a person learns to listen at the level of whispers, something remarkable becomes possible with emotions too. Because feelings, much like the body, are rarely finished the moment they first arrive. Most of them are still waiting for permission to complete something they started a long time ago. Most people treat emotions like problems to be solved as quickly as possible. Sadness shows up, and the instinct is to distract, numb, or push through it. Anger rises, and the reflex is to suppress it before it causes damage. But emotions were never designed to be solved. They were designed to move, to rise, peak, and complete themselves naturally, the same way a wave builds and eventually breaks on the shore. The real suffering usually doesn't come from the emotion itself. It comes from interrupting that natural cycle halfway through, over and over again, until the body is carrying dozens of unfinished waves that never got permission to reach the shore. Picture a man who lost his father at 19 and, needing to stay strong for his mother and younger siblings, never allowed himself to properly grieve. He went straight back to work, buried the funeral under responsibility, and told himself there wasn't time to fall apart. 20 years later, a completely unrelated loss, a job change, nothing catastrophic, triggered a grief response so overwhelming it frightened him. He wasn't only grieving the recent loss, he was finally grieving his father 2 decades late, because that original wave had never been allowed to finish. A practical approach here: The next time a strong emotion arrives, instead of managing it, try letting it move through the body completely. Cry until the crying naturally stops on its own, shake if the body wants to shake, voice the anger privately until it runs its course. Completion, not control, is the goal. This reframes something most people were taught backwards. Emotional maturity was never about staying calm no matter what. It was about allowing feeling to happen fully, without interruption, without an audience to perform composure for. Therapists who work in somatic experiencing, a field developed by Peter Levine, often point to this exact mechanism. Trauma isn't caused by the intensity of an event alone, but by a nervous system response that got frozen mid-cycle and never finished discharging. The wave got stuck exactly where it was interrupted, and it stays there, sometimes for decades, waiting. This changes everything about how healing actually works. It isn't about becoming someone who no longer feels difficult things. It's about becoming someone who finally lets themselves feel them completely, all the way through, without cutting the process short out of fear, shame, or timing that never felt convenient. And once every unfinished wave is finally allowed to reach its shore, something unexpected starts happening, not just emotionally, but physically, in ways the body has been quietly waiting to demonstrate the entire time a person thought healing was only happening in the mind. There's an old assumption buried in almost every self-help conversation that healing is something done to a person, delivered by the right teacher, the right book, the right technique finally discovered after years of searching. But every idea explored so far points towards something far more radical. A person was never only the wounded soil waiting to be tended. They were also, this entire time, the one holding the tools. The one who decides what gets watered and what gets left to wither. The one who chooses, moment by moment, which thoughts get planted deep enough to take root, and which ones get pulled before they ever have the chance to grow into something permanent. Consider someone who spent years believing they were simply an anxious person, as though anxiety were a fixed trait woven into their DNA, unchangeable and final. That belief itself was a seed, planted early, watered daily through repetition. I always overthink. I've always been like this. This is just who I am. Nothing changed until the moment they recognized their role wasn't only the garden being described. They were also the gardener holding the watering can, choosing daily which thoughts got attention and which got left alone to die out naturally. A practical shift worth trying immediately. For the next week, notice every time an old self-limiting phrase surfaces, "I'm always like this, I can't change this part of me," and instead plant a different sentence in its place. Not forced positivity, just a more accurate, more spacious version of the truth. This is the final integration of everything explored so far. The breath that closes doors, the compassion for what isn't fixed yet, the emotions finally allowed to finish, the ground remembering the body finally being heard. None of these were separate techniques operating in isolation. They were all expressions of the same underlying truth. A person holds far more agency over their internal world than they were ever taught to believe. The mind runs on repetition, the same way soil responds to whatever gets planted in it consistently. Change the daily planting, and eventually, unavoidably, the entire landscape starts to shift. And this shift was never only mental. It shows up physically too. Sleep that finally deepens after months of restlessness. Energy that returns without forcing it. A body that stops bracing constantly against a threat that was mostly happening in thought rather than in reality. Health, in every sense of the word, tends to follow wherever attention consistently goes. The person who spent this entire journey believing they needed rescuing was, the whole time, fully capable of rescuing themselves. One seed, one breath, one honest moment of attention at a time. The only real question left is whether they're willing to pick the watering can back up, starting today.